I was refilling the bird feeder on the back deck when my phone buzzed on the railing, and my daughter's name lit up the screen with a text that started with the words, "Dad, before you say yes to walking me down the aisle, there's something we need to go over." I set the seed bag down and opened it, expecting a logistics question, maybe about timing or which shoes to wear. Instead, there were 18 numbered items, and item 1 told me I was not allowed to give a speech at the reception unless it was first approved, word for word, by her fiancé's mother. I read it twice, standing there in the Ohio morning cold with my coffee going flat in my other hand, and I remember thinking, this has to be a joke my daughter's playing on her old man. It was not a joke. Before I go further tonight, I want to say thank you for being here with me. If you're a father, or you raised a daughter, or you've ever loved someone enough to swallow your pride for them, I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. Drop your city below. I read every one. And I'll say plainly, some details in this story have been adjusted for privacy, but every feeling in it is real, and I think you'll understand why by the end. My name is Walter Pruitt. Most folks around Millhaven, Ohio call me Walt. I'm 62 years old, and for 35 of those years I ran the print shop on Route 9, the one with the faded green awning that's been there since Nixon was in office. I set type by hand for the first 15 years before the digital presses came in, and I like to say my hands still remember the weight of a metal letter better than they remember most people's names. I sold the shop 18 months ago to a young couple from Columbus who wanted to turn half of it into a coffee bar. I told them that was fine by me, as long as they kept the old Heidelberg press in the front window. They did. I drive by sometimes just to look at it sitting there, dignified and useless, like an old dog that still knows how to sit, even though nobody asks him to fetch anymore. My wife's name is Carol. We've been married 39 years this June. She taught 4th grade at Millhaven Elementary for 3 decades before her hip made the stairs to the classroom a daily negotiation. She retired the same spring I sold the shop, and people kept telling us how wonderful it must be. 2 working folks finally free at the same time. Mostly it's wonderful. Sometimes, like tonight, it just means there are 2 of us sitting at the same kitchen table trying to understand how the daughter we raised could have sent an email like the one sitting on my phone. Our daughter is Renee. She's 31, works as an event coordinator for a hotel chain out of Cleveland, engaged to a man named Preston Holloway, whose mother, Diane, owns 3 boutique event planning companies and, according to Renee, runs in different circles than we're used to. I hadn't thought much of that phrase when Renee first said it 8 months ago, introducing us to Preston at Easter dinner. I think about it differently now. I carried my phone inside and set it on the kitchen table, screen down, the way you'd set down something that had gotten too hot to hold. Carol was at the stove finishing the pot roast, humming along to the radio the way she does when she doesn't know yet that anything's wrong. "Walt," she said without turning, "did Renee text you back about the tuxedo fitting?" "She texted," I said. "It's not about the fitting." Something in my voice made her turn the burner down and look at me properly. I picked the phone back up and read her the first item. No unapproved speeches. Then item 2, which said that I was expected to walk Renee exactly halfway down the aisle and then step back, because Preston's stepfather, a man named Corbin who Renee had known for 4 years, would be the one to formally give her away at the altar, since he had, in Renee's words, been the one who showed up. Carol's dish towel slipped out of her hand onto the floor. I want to tell you the rest of those 18 items slowly, the way I read them that night, because that's how they landed, not all at once, but one gut punch at a time. Item 3 said we were not permitted to introduce ourselves as Renee's parents to any guest from the Holloway side, unless specifically asked, because Diane felt it created confusing dynamics with Corbin's role. Item 4 said Carol was to wear a dress from a boutique Diane owned, in a color Diane would choose, and that under no circumstances was Carol to wear anything homemade or altered, which stung in a particular way, because Carol had spent 6 weeks after her hip surgery teaching herself to sew again, and she'd already picked out fabric for a dress she meant to make herself. Item 5 forbade us from bringing a gift directly. All gifts were to be routed through a registry curated by Diane's firm to avoid redundancy and maintain aesthetic cohesion at the gift table. Item 6 said neither of us could post photographs from the wedding on social media without approval for a period of 1 year following the event. Item 7. And this was the one that finally made my hands go cold. Said I was not to discuss my former occupation with guests, because Diane felt that conversations about blue-collar trades could make certain guests, and here Renee had actually typed the words Diane had used to her, feel like they're at the wrong kind of wedding. 35 years. 35 years of setting type until my fingertips went numb, of teaching half the graduating classes of Millhaven High how to run a letterpress in a Tuesday afternoon shop class I volunteered for without pay, of printing every wedding invitation, funeral program, and church bulletin this town had needed since 1989. And my daughter's future mother-in-law didn't want anyone hearing about it in case it embarrassed somebody's cousin from Shaker Heights. I read items 8 through 14 out loud to Carol at the kitchen table while the pot roast went cold in the oven, neither of us moving to turn it off. No dancing unless invited onto the floor by Preston directly. No conversations lasting longer than what Renee called a polite 3 minutes with any Halloway relative. Seating would be determined entirely by Diane's placement chart, and Carol and I would learn our table only the morning of the wedding. A minimum contribution of $4,000 was expected toward the reception costs, to reflect appropriate investment in the day, though we would have no say whatsoever in how any of it was spent. And item 14, which I read twice because I couldn't believe my daughter had typed it and hit send, said that if either of us became visibly emotional during the ceremony crying, in plain English, a designated member of the bridal party would quietly approach and offer us a tissue and gentle redirection to compose ourselves, so as not to disrupt the photography timeline. Carol didn't say anything for a long moment after that one. She just walked to the sink, turned the water on, and stood there with her hands under the tap, even though there was nothing to wash. I got up and turned off the oven. Then I went and stood behind her, and I put my hand on her shoulder, and she said, without turning around, in a voice smaller than I'd heard from her in years, "Walter, what did we do wrong?" I didn't have an answer. I still don't. Not really. Not one that makes clean sense. What I had was 18 conditions on my phone and a wife whose shoulders were shaking under my hand in a kitchen we'd owned for 26 years, and a feeling settling into my chest like cold water finding the low spot in a basement floor. I didn't sleep much that night. Around 4 in the morning, I gave up trying and went down to the garage, where I still kept my father's old handset type cases, 3 drawers of lead letters sorted by size that I hadn't touched in years, but couldn't bring myself to sell. I sat on the stool out there in the cold and did what I do when I can't make sense of something. I started thinking backward, trying to find where the thread had first pulled loose. Renee had always been careful, even as a little girl, careful about what people thought of her. I used to tell Carol that our daughter had been born checking the room for approval before she smiled. I hadn't minded that. Not really. The world rewards careful people. Mostly, but sitting in that garage at 4 in the morning, I started remembering things I hadn't let myself look at straight on before. The way she'd stopped mentioning the print shop to her college friends somewhere around sophomore year. The way, when Preston first met us, she'd introduced my trade as he used to run a small design business downtown, which was technically not a lie, but wasn't the truth either. I hadn't corrected her in front of him. I told myself it wasn't worth making a scene over. I thought about the year Renee's car got totaled her sophomore year of college, hit by a drunk driver on the interstate outside Athens. Carol and I didn't have the cash sitting around for a replacement, not free and clear. So I took out a second loan against the print shop, told Renee it was no trouble, and spent the next 4 years paying it down quietly on top of the business loan I already carried. She never asked where the money came from. I never told her. I thought that was what a father did. I thought about the fall 2 years back, the one that still catches in my right hip when the weather turns. Renee and Preston had bought their first house that spring, an old Victorian in need of everything, and Preston had mentioned, almost in passing at a family dinner, that the estimate to redo the wraparound porch railings had come back higher than they wanted to pay. I didn't say much at the dinner table. 3 days later, I drove over with my tools and spent a Saturday up on a ladder replacing rotted porch posts by myself. 60 years old, because that's what you do when your daughter needs something, and you know how to make it. I misjudged the last post. The ladder shifted on wet grass, and I came down 8 feet onto packed dirt. Broke my hip in 2 places. 6 weeks in a rehab facility. Renee visited once, for maybe 20 minutes, before saying she had a work call. Preston never came at all. Carol slept in a recliner beside my hospital bed for 4 nights running because she said she wasn't going to let me wake up alone in the dark in a place that wasn't home. I sat with all of that in the garage until the sky through the small window went from black to gray, the way it does before a Ohio winter morning decides what kind of day it's going to be. Then I heard Carol's footsteps in the kitchen above me, the particular sound of her moving the coffee canister, and I knew she was up too. I stood to head inside, and my elbow caught the corner of an old cedar chest I kept against the garage wall, one I'd built the same year Renee was born. The lid, which had never quite sat right, popped open, and something slid off the top shelf inside and landed on the concrete floor with a soft thud. I bent down, my hip complaining the way it always does now, and picked it up. It was a shoebox, the cardboard gone soft and gray with age, held closed with a rubber band that snapped the moment I touched it. Inside were envelopes, dozens of them, each one labeled in Carol's handwriting, the careful, patient cursive she uses for things she means to keep. The first envelope said, simply, Renee 1996. I opened it. Inside was a folded piece of notebook paper, and on it, in Carol's hand, set aside $22 from substitute teaching check. Renee needs new shoes for kindergarten, but I want there to be something left over for later, when she needs something bigger and doesn't know to ask. I sat back down on the stool, the shoebox in my lap, and I went through every single envelope, 26 years of them. Carol had been taking extra substitute days at the elementary school every single one of those years, sometimes 40, 50 days a summer, days she never once complained about, days I genuinely believed she was choosing because she loved being useful. In envelope after envelope, in her small, careful writing, she'd recorded what she'd set aside and why. A summer of substitute pay that covered Renee's braces when our dental coverage came up short, and Carol had written, told Walt, the orthodontist, gave us a discount. He didn't. I didn't want him to feel like he couldn't provide. A year she'd sold her mother's antique sewing machine, the one with the mother-of-pearl inlay she'd always said she'd pass down to Renee someday, to cover the gap between Renee's scholarship and her actual tuition bill sophomore year the same year. I realized, with my chest going tight, that I was quietly paying down the loan for her totaled car. Neither of us had known what the other was carrying. We'd each been protecting the other from the weight of it, and in doing that, we'd built something between us that Renee had never once seen. The last envelope was dated 8 months ago, right around the time Renee announced the engagement. Inside was a single sheet, and at the bottom Carol had written a total, 26 years, $31,400. Set aside a little at a time, so our daughter would never once feel the floor go out from under her. Below that she'd written, "This isn't a debt, and I never wanted her to know the cost of it. I just needed, somewhere, a record that I did right by her, in case anyone ever needed proof. If you're the one finding this, Walter, I'm sorry I never told you. You would have insisted on carrying more of it yourself, and I couldn't let you. You'd already given enough. I did not cry in that garage. I want to be honest about that, the way I'd want anyone to be honest with me." My eyes burned in that particular way. A man's eyes burn when something in him is too large to let out cleanly, and I sat there with my jaw locked and my thumb pressed hard against my own knuckles, and I did not cry. What I did was fold that last sheet of paper back along its worn crease, place it back in its envelope, and put the whole shoebox in the crook of my arm like something that might break if I held it wrong. Then I stood, and I walked into the kitchen, where Carol was pouring coffee, and when she saw what I was carrying, the mug slipped an inch in her hand before she caught it. "You found it," she said. Not a question. "I found it," I said. 26 years, Carol." She set the coffee pot down very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands aren't fully steady. "I didn't want you to feel like you were failing us," she said. "You were never failing us, Walter. Not once. I needed somewhere to put it. All of it. So I'd know I did right by her." I put the shoebox down on the counter and I put my arms around my wife of 39 years, standing in the kitchen where we'd raised our daughter, and I thought about a piece of type sitting crooked in its form, one letter, just slightly out of alignment, throwing off the whole line until you said it right. That's what I felt like, standing there, like something in me had finally been set right, even though everything around it was still a mess. I spent that whole weekend in the garage. I had a plank of black walnut I'd been saving for 11 years, since before I sold the shop, wood I'd bought off a farmer 2 counties over who was clearing a fence line and didn't know what he had. I'd never found the right project for it. I knew, standing in front of it that Saturday morning, exactly what it was for. I built a box, not fancy in the way Diane Halloway's boutique catalog would call fancy, but honest dovetailed corners cut by hand the way my own father taught me 60 years ago. A lid that closed with a soft, satisfying weight, brass hinges I'd been holding onto in a coffee can since before Renee was born. I sanded it through 5 grits until the walnut held the light the way old wood does when it's been respected. On the underside of the lid, where you'd only find it if you opened the box and looked, I carved 4 words with the same small chisel I'd used to set type corrections for 3 decades. Renee from both of us. Carol lined the inside with a scrap of blue velvet from a dress she'd never gotten around to finishing. Inside, I placed the shoebox of envelopes, all 26 years of them, and beside it a single page in my own handwriting, plain and short, the way I say most things that matter. I'm not writing this to make you feel guilty, and I'm not writing it to be forgiven. I'm writing it because your mother has been quietly making sure you never went without for 26 years and never once asked for a thank you. I think you should know what it cost her. I think you should know what love actually looks like, since I'm not sure anyone's shown you lately. I called Renee that evening. She picked up sounding rushed, the way she always did those days, like every conversation was squeezed between 2 more important ones. Hey Dad, is this about the 18 items? Because Diane really does need confirmation by, we'll be there, I said. We'll follow the arrangements. Your mother and I will be at table wherever we're assigned. We won't discuss my old trade. We won't cry where anybody can see it. There was a pause on the line. Okay, she said, and I could hear something uncertain under the relief in her voice, like she'd braced for a fight and didn't quite know what to do without one. Thank you, Dad. I know it's a lot. Diane just really wants everything to feel cohesive. I understand, I said. And then, because it was true, and because it was the only piece of the truth I trusted myself to say out loud that night, I added, we love you, Renee. We'll see you at the wedding. My brother-in-law Dennis was invited. He'd stayed close with Preston's side through some overlapping business dealings, and I asked him if he'd be willing to carry the box in himself and set it quietly on the gift table, so that whatever happened, it would already be in the room before anyone thought to stop it. Dennis looked at that walnut box a long time before he answered. Walt, he said, that might be the finest thing you've ever built. Then he said he'd be honored. The wedding was held at a restored barn venue outside Chagrin Falls, the kind of place with string lights and a $10,000 minimum, exactly the kind of setting Diane Halloway's business specialized in. Carol and I drove up together on a gray Saturday morning in October, and I wore the same navy suit I'd worn to my own father's funeral, not the tailored charcoal one Diane's assistant had emailed us a link for. It fit. It was honest. That was enough for me. We arrived at the time specified, checked in with a young woman holding a tablet who informed us, with a bright, practiced smile, that we'd been seated at table 16, near the service entrance. We didn't argue. We found our seats among the caterers' rolling carts and the low hum of the kitchen doors swinging open and shut, and we sat down, and we waited. The ceremony itself was lovely in the way expensive things usually are. String quartet, white orchids, 180 guests dressed like they'd stepped out of a magazine. When Renee came down the aisle on Corbin's arm, in a gown Diane had chosen, she was beautiful, and something in my chest ached in a way I hadn't expected, watching my daughter walk toward the rest of her life, escorted by a man who'd known her 4 years, while the man who'd taught her to ride a bike sat in a folding chair by the kitchen door. I didn't make a sound. Carol's hand found mine under the tablecloth and held on hard enough that I could feel her pulse. Dinner came and went. The champagne made its rounds. And then the MC, a polished man in his 40s who clearly did this for a living, announced that before the dancing began, the Halloway family had arranged a special gift presentation, curated personally by Diane, to honor the people who helped build this beautiful union. I want to tell you what happened next, slowly, because that's how it happened. one careful piece at a time, the whole room tilting almost without anyone noticing until it had tilted all the way over. The gifts from Preston's side came first: a crystal decanter set from an uncle, a framed aerial photograph of the venue from Diane herself, presented with a small speech about investing in aesthetic excellence. Then a server lifted the walnut box from the end of the table and carried it up to where Renee and Preston sat. I watched my daughter's face when she saw it. She knew that would. She knew my hands had made it. She opened the lid slowly, lifted out my letter first, read it in silence, her jaw tightening by degrees. Then she lifted out the shoebox itself, and Diane, standing nearby in the particular way of a woman who inserts herself into any moment worth narrating, leaned over and said, brightly, to the microphone the MC still held loosely at his side, "Oh, how sweet, what's inside?" Before Renee could answer, before she could close the lid and steer the moment somewhere private, Diane had already lifted the first envelope out and opened it herself, the way people do who've never once been told no in a room like that. "Renee, 1,996, she read aloud, her voice carrying easily to the nearest tables, that particular tone people use when they think they're about to share something charming. Set aside $22 from substitute teaching check. Renee needs new shoes for kindergarten." Diane's smile faltered, just slightly, at the next line. "But I want there to be something left over for later, when she needs something bigger and doesn't know to ask." The tables nearest the platform went quiet. Diane, to her credit, or perhaps simply out of momentum, kept reading, pulling envelope after envelope, her voice growing less performative and more uncertain with each one. "Sold her mother's sewing machine, the one with the mother-of-pearl inlay, for tuition. Told Walt the school gave a discount. I didn't want him to feel like he couldn't provide." I watched Carol's hands go still in her lap. I watched Renee's face change, watched 26 years land on her all at once, the way water finally breaks through when a dam's been cracking for longer than anyone admitted. Diane reached the final page and read the total aloud without quite meaning to, her voice thinning out. 26 years. $31,400. This isn't a debt. I never wanted her to know the cost of it. The barn had gone silent enough that you could hear the string lights humming faintly overhead. Diane set the page down slowly, and for the first time since I'd met her, she didn't seem to have a prepared next sentence. That's when Dennis stood up from his seat 2 tables back. He didn't need a microphone. "I've known Carol and Walt Pruitt going on 30 years, he said, his voice carrying clean across the barn. "I watched Walt fall off a ladder rebuilding porch posts for this same couple, because Preston mentioned once at dinner that a contractor's, quote, came in too high, broke his hip in 2 places. 60 years old." He looked toward Preston, not unkindly, just plainly. "You visited the hospital for 20 minutes. A woman I didn't recognize, seated near table 2, put her hand over her mouth. I found out later it was Preston's aunt." Diane tried to recover, tried to say something about context, about how families do things differently, about investment and appropriate contribution, but her voice had lost whatever confidence it started the evening with, and the room was no longer listening to her the way it had an hour before. Renee didn't say anything for a long moment. She stood there on the little platform in her wedding gown, holding a shoebox full of her mother's handwriting, and when she finally looked out across the barn, she found our table by the kitchen doors, and this time, unlike every moment since that first email had landed on my phone 18 days earlier, she did not look away. I stood up. Not dramatically, my hip doesn't allow for drama anymore, but I stood. And Carol stood beside me, and I said, quiet enough that it was really only meant for her, "We'll head out. Sweetheart, take your time." I wasn't angry anymore, standing there. I want you to understand that. Whatever had been sitting cold in my chest since that first text message had already done its work simply by being seen. We didn't need anything more from that room. We were halfway to the door when Renee's voice stopped us. "Dad." Just that. I turned around. She was walking toward us, gown gathered in one hand, the shoebox still held against her chest with the other, and when she reached us, she didn't say anything else for a moment, just wrapped both arms around me, box and all. Right there in front of 180 guests who had, 20 minutes earlier, watched her try to hide us near the kitchen. "I didn't know," she said into my shoulder. "Mom, I didn't know any of it. I know, Carol said, and put her hand on our daughter's back the way she used to when Renee was small and the world had gotten too big for one night. You know now. We didn't stay for the dancing. That felt right, for all of us. Renee walked us to the car herself, still in her gown, and stood in the gravel lot a long time before she said anything else. I have a lot to fix, she said. With you both, and with everything. You do, I said, but you're standing here instead of back in there performing for people who laughed at your father. That's a start. Preston called 2 days later, and to his credit, he didn't try to explain his mother's behavior or his own silence. He said he'd been so focused on keeping the peace in his own family that he'd stopped noticing what it was costing mine. I told him that was a start too. Renee calls most Sundays now. Real calls. The kind where she asks how my hip's doing before she asks anything else. The kind where she started asking questions about the print shop, about the letterpress in the window she used to be embarrassed to mention. Last month she asked if I'd teach her to set type sometime, the way I used to teach the shop kids on Tuesday afternoons. I told her the offer's always open. Carol still has that shoebox. It sits on the dresser in our bedroom now instead of a shelf in the garage. And every so often I catch her adding something new to it, not money anymore. Just notes. Little things. Renee called just to talk today. Didn't need anything. Just wanted to talk. I think that's its own kind of currency. The kind that doesn't run out no matter how many years you spend setting it aside. People ask me sometimes if I regret building that box. If I regret letting Diane get her hands on something so private in a room full of strangers. I tell them the truth. I built it, hoping it would simply be seen by the one person it was meant for. What happened after that wasn't revenge, not the way folks mean when they use that word. It was just 26 years of quiet love, finally getting the light it was always owed. And if there's someone in your life who's been carrying something like that for you quietly, without asking for credit, I hope you find out what it is before a room full of strangers has to tell you first. If this story stayed with you tonight, tell me where you're watching from, and stay a while longer. There's always another story worth telling.